Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Sarah, thanks so much for that introduction. I am very excited to be here. This is my first AIAEE conference, if you will. So I was very excited to meet you all in person, but we are rolling with it, right? So I'm thankful to be able to see you and meet you all virtually. You don't know this, but I'm looking at your small photos if your camera is on. And this is my way of getting to know the audience a little bit better. So hello, how are you? I am going to share my screen with you. One moment. All right. And Sarah, I'm looking at you. Can you see the slides? Awesome. Okay. So today we're going to just spend a little bit of time focusing on culturally relevant community building. This is just a start. So I'm hoping that this is a building block for us to think about how we can not only practice and implement certain practices within our workshops or community education that we offer, but also how can we begin to think about this more broadly and how we impact and engage not only in our classrooms potentially, but also just within the outlying community. So just to give you a little roadmap, we're gonna start with the warm-up. We're gonna talk a little bit about community and why that's important. Spend a brief amount of time thinking about how identities play into what we do. Focus on equity and equality, cultural relevancy, challenges and opportunities, and then close with some important things to remember with time for Q&A, of course. So before we get started, what I would like for us to do is just to spend a moment of reflection, individually, personally, in our space, wherever that may be, to reflect and hold space to acknowledge that individuals here and now in this time are experiencing multiple layers of harm, stress, and uncertainty, and overall emotion across the globe as it relates to health issues with COVID-19 and uncertainty, but also with the amplified racial injustice broadcast across the country and across the globe with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So I'm just asking if we could spend one moment within ourselves just to reflect. Thank you. Now, what I'd like for us to do next is I want to ask if you would be so inclined to do a 2-word check-in with me. So if you would utilize your chat box, if you have the capacity to do so. I know that some of us might be moving around. If you have the capacity, if you could just do a 2-word check-in in the chat box, give me 2 words that describe how you're feeling today. And I'm gonna be on the lookout on the chat. Happy Friday, 2 words exactly, yes. Tired and reflective, absolutely. Thankful and happy. Mike, yes, stressed and tired. I'm so thankful it's Friday. Awake and blessed. Thank you so much. Weekend ready, yes, Sarah. So thank you so much for engaging. As you can see, just looking at our peers and colleagues who are sharing on the 2-word chat, there's a lot of similarity, but it's really just nice to check in to see how people are doing. And some of the things that I've seen are thankful and grateful, as well as a mixture of being a little exhausted and overwhelmed, and that is okay, right? It's okay to name that, and it's okay to take the space for all of those feelings. So thank you for that. We are going to move along. So what we're going to start with is a warm-up. Now, in person, some people would groan a little bit when I said warm-up, because warm-up sounds like we're about to do some exercises. Don't worry, we are not about to do any exercises right now. If you want to, awesome. More power to you. But I'm going to ask for us to take some time to connect in small groups. So Sarah's going to hook it up, but before we go into our small groups, I'm going to give you the instructions. So here are the instructions. Well, they were there. All right. So the instructions, and this is all I'm asking you to do, is to draw or share. I know for some of us, we might not be in a space where we can write something down. So if the drawing doesn't pertain to you, sharing is totally fine. If you would draw or share the 3 most important things you do on a daily basis. Again, draw the 3 most important things you do on a daily basis. all drawing skills are welcome, including mine, which are stick figures. So think about that. And again, if you don't have the capacity to actually draw something right now, sharing is totally fine. And then in your small groups, the only thing we ask you to do is to share what you drew and why those were the 3 things that you shared when you were asked what are your most important things you do. The one question I always get, so I'm going to answer it in advance, is do you mean my professional life or my personal life? Whatever you want to give me, right? If these are all gelled together, give them to me. Or if you are wearing one specific hat right now in this workshop, please feel free to give me whatever is most relevant for you right now. Sarah, would you do me the favor of inviting people to some small breakout rooms? And we're going to give you about 5 to 7 minutes. I will call you back and give you a 1-minute warning so you don't get sucked back out into Zoom world without knowing. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome, welcome. All right, waiting just for a few more people. I think we're good. Welcome back. Welcome. Okay, so we're going to jump right back into where we left off. So I want to get your sense of how was that activity for you? So if you would feel so inclined to, please use your chat box, and or you can unmute yourself and let me know, what did you think about that activity? How was it for you? Thank you. Yep. Enjoyed getting to know people a little bit better. Helps me participants, absolutely. And the interesting thing about this one is I used to, of course, right, we used to do lots of things in person, face to face, and we had to think about how do we get people to engage with each other and connect a little bit more, even if we are on Zoom or virtual. So this is something that I'm offering up to you as something you could potentially utilize. It's a very easy, no materials needed or very minor materials needed when you think about how to get people engaged with each other. And absolutely, one of the really wonderful things about something like this is that it allows us to connect with people in a way that most of the time when we are in a work environment, we don't necessarily have the opportunity, or we forget about the opportunity to connect with somebody. I'm assuming, right, I didn't hop into any of your groups because I wanted to give you some privacy to connect a little bit more. But I'm sure some of us talked about family, right? What's some of the things that we do? And some of us probably talked about family or caring for children or caring for our parents or, you know, a spiritual practice perhaps. So these are really important. And these are things that often don't get talked about when we are in our working environments because we are very focused, right? We are focused on accomplishing goals, maybe checking off our to-do list, which is also very important. But when we think about it, if people are offering up these 3 things that are the most important things they do every single day, it's important to also know that those will let you know a little bit more about an individual and will also impact how that person moves through life, right? Moves through their daily life. So I offer that up to you as a really quick and easy activity, but also something that really does highlight the importance of being mindful of these really small things that get overlooked but are really impactful for an individual and to get to know each other. So I want to jump into the importance of community. We're here to talk about community building in particular, but also thinking about how to be inclusive and culturally mindful and relevant when we are building our community. So I'm big on using the chat box and or unmuting yourself. So we're going to talk a little about the importance of community, but feel free to use the chat box at any time. Why do you think community is important? Why is a community important for individuals, whether it be workspace or personal space? Sense of belonging, absolutely. And so I want to offer up a few collaborations. Yes, absolutely. So one of the things I want to offer up is a few more as people are adding. This is wonderful. Thank you for your contributions. is specifically when we think and center ourselves around teaching or educating individuals. Right? Community is important for teaching for lots of reasons. And I've just identified a few, but one is it's a constant reminder that we're not alone, right? We are not the only ones learning something at this point. And sometimes that is really helpful because when I learn something for the first time, I might look around to see, is anyone else shocked about this? Or is anyone else new to this information? And so that's really helpful. The other thing is it's an opportunity to share our vulnerabilities. And we'll talk a little bit, very briefly though, at the end about the importance of vulnerability. But there is power in having groups learn together, and also groups acknowledging that some of us didn't know that, and not being the only one in that space that didn't know that is also really helpful. And it definitely helps and to expand our skills and strengths, not just because there's lots of varied experiences within our groups. More importantly, right, knowledge can come from all different angles. It's not just from the top down, right? It is not just from the facilitator, but that education piece is going across the board from community members as well. And the second piece is, how do we strengthen this community? So one of the big pieces is listening to people's stories. Oftentimes we are charged with helping facilitate, whether that be community education, right, an extension program, a class perhaps. And because we have so many marks to hit, right, so many goals to accomplish, oftentimes people's narratives get forgotten, right? People's asking for people's insight, asking what people think about certain things, or how this knowledge could relate to their daily household life is really important, because oftentimes we don't have enough time in the day, right? And because we acknowledge we don't have enough time in the day, being a little more mindful of how these stories can be incorporated into what we teach is really helpful. The other thing to think about too is to share our own story. This requires a sense of vulnerability. And for some of us, that comes easy. For others of us, like myself, that can come harder. So I have to be mindful and think about, if I'm asking students or community members to reflect on something or share a vulnerable piece, I will practice that by offering my piece of vulnerability first. Now, I'm not asking us to talk about our relationship issues perhaps, or our lack of this, or our want for this, but really being specific about maybe acknowledging that I also struggled with learning about privilege, right? Or I also struggled with learning about how my identity impacts X, Y, or Z. So offering that up is a really nice way to encourage participants and let them know that you are also still learning, and you don't hold yourself into the space of, I know everything. Communicating in ways that is beneficial to all. And then the last one is setting clear expectations of members. So when we have a strong community or are building our community, a way to do that is also to set very clear expectations about what we expect from each other in a group, and also what we hope to accomplish, right? And what we need to accomplish that. So I'm briefly going to talk about identity. I love to talk about identity, so I'm going to keep it short, I promise. But identity is a basic sense of who we are, right? It's everything we do, right? We've grown in our identities over the years based on people who've loved us and raised us, all the way into now that we can sort of think for ourselves and understand our beliefs and values. This plays into who we are. And this is not an exhaustive list, but a few identities that we can be mindful of are our nationality, perhaps, or the region that we come from. I know in Florida, the region is really important because as a state, not only are we diverse with the commodities that we produce, we're also diverse in the populations across the state. The other thing is religion and spirituality, perhaps. Different activities can play a huge role in how we see ourselves. For example, if we've lived our entire life surrounded by sports, right? We might be coaches, right? We might be involved in different capacities. That impacts how people understand themselves and each other, as well as education or farming, for example. If students or individuals come from a farming background, that is going to definitely play a role in how they understand the world and how they understand themselves. And my question that I want us to think about briefly, and again, feel free to use that chat box or unmute yourself, is why is understanding our identities important for the work that we do? Right? And this can be something that we hold on to as a question for reflection later, but why is understanding our identities important for the work that we do?
I was thinking, I didn't know that you were moving on. I thought you asked us the
No,
question.
that's fine. I love engaging. Go ahead.
I think it's very important because sometimes people think that identities are just like in isolation, but it's always intersectional. And sometimes we judge people by thinking about their single stories, but it's actually intersectional, and we have multiple layers to ourselves. And we sometimes do not have grace for others, thinking that how come they didn't get that or this and that and things like that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And if we think back to, that was beautiful, and thinking back to the beginning activity where we sort of just shared the most important things we do on a daily basis, we also might have learned, or that also provides us the opportunity to learn about some of the identities without people saying, hello, my name is Cece. My identities are blah, 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 right? So people have offered, for me, I would offer up the most important thing I do is every day, one of them is I talk to my mother every day. I'm an only child, so you would learn that about me and learn that we are very close. You would also probably learn that I absolutely love my dog because I have long walks with my dog every day and we talk about a lot of things. He's a good listener. So you would also acknowledge that, oh, she didn't necessarily talk about having children perhaps, but she talked about this dog. So clearly, right, there is something there. And that is also plays into getting to know me a little bit better, as opposed to, okay, here's my professional title and this is what I teach. Because it is absolutely true that we are multifaceted, right? We are multidimensional. We have lots of layers, and all of our identities, no matter how hard we try to leave something at the door when we enter professionally, they come with us. And it is important to think about how we also offer the opportunity for our community members, our participants in workshops, our students, to be comfortable bringing their entire self to the table and into the space, as opposed to saying, you can only bring your student self in, right? Or you can only bring your community member hat in this space. You can't bring your mothering, your fathering, right? Your student perspective into the space. So we're going to transition just a little bit further to think about what does it mean to be culturally relevant. Now, this is like a fancy smancy word, and it's definitely important, but there's an easier way to think about this in the sense of how are we mindful of people's cultures and how that impacts how we learn and how we teach. So being culturally relevant, I'm going to offer up a quote from Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who coined cultural relevancy and is the hallmark scholar for thinking about this even further. And she specifically says, when she's thinking about students, is culturally relevant practices, they empower students to maintain cultural integrity while succeeding academically. And so breaking this down just a little further, what this means is it enables participants, when we are culturally relevant, we enable participants to relate to workshop content in their cultural context. So we are inviting them to bring their lens, if you will, to a workshop. It also means that we are not modifying the individual to understand the curriculum. Rather, we are modifying the curriculum and enhancing the curriculum to ensure that it meets the needs, especially the cultural needs of an individual. This may sound easy from afar. I have to acknowledge it is not easy. It does require a lot of reflection and also additional time that we are always wanting and needing more of, I'm sure. But when we think about this, the key for me when I was learning about this concept in school and really trying to think about my education methods is ensuring that people in my workshops, that students in my classes, don't feel like they have to pretend to be something else, or that they can't bring their home environment or their personal practice to the classroom. Rather, they can bring that in because what we're learning can apply in all different areas to their personal identities. And the last thing I just want to talk about briefly is that this quote is that we are more likely to see the world through our own eyes and assume that others see the world in the exact same way. I've done lots of activities where we talk about perspective, and we ask someone, everyone gets the same photo, if you will. And we ask, don't show the photo to anyone, but you try to explain the photo to someone else. And most of the time, individuals don't know that we have the same photo in the room until the very end, because the way that we explain things to each other, even if it's the same photo, is very different because our perspectives are very unique, right? They are specific to who we are and how we understand the world. So just being mindful that even though we understand the world one way, people will experience it in their own way because we have different lived experiences. I'm going to briefly talk about the difference between equality and equity. This is something that comes up quite frequently in conversations, and the terms are utilized interchangeably quite frequently. So we're going to start with equality. And equality, specifically, the root word is equal. So if we think about that, we're thinking that everyone gets the exact same thing. So if you look at the photo on the left, it shows 3 individuals wanting to see a baseball game over the fence. And this is a photo of equality because everyone got one box to stand on, right? Everyone got the same thing. Is it equal? Absolutely. Does it allow each of those individuals to reach the goal, which was to watch the game? No, it doesn't. It also assumes that everyone starts from the exact same place and needs the exact same thing. So again, this is equality with the emphasis of the word equal, because it assumes that everyone needs the exact same thing to be successful. Now, the equity, did I do 2 of the same? Oh, equity, got it. Sorry. So this is supposed to say equity. So equity, if you look at this photo right here, specifically shows something very different, even though equality and equity are interchangeable. Equity specifically focuses on giving everyone what they need to succeed. So if you look at the photo to the left, the person in the blue didn't need a box to stand on anyway to start with because they could already see the game. The person in the red got 1 box because they needed 1 box to be able to see, just like the person in the blue shirt. And the person in the purple shirt got 2 boxes because they needed 2 boxes to be able to see, just like the other 2 individuals in the photo. So when we think about this, it's important to remember to ask, right? Asking people what they need is at the heart of being culturally relevant and inclusive when we think about how we teach and how we offer resources to individuals. And it's asking and understanding what someone needs, not necessarily just asking, but also understanding why that is a specific need for a group or a community or a person. And unfortunately, like I said, equality and equity are interchanged, and my apologies for the mix-up of the labeling. That sort of shows like the interchangeable issues that happen quite frequently. But it's important to be mindful and to ask specifically what an individual needs. The example I give my students in class is if I signed my students up to run a 5K and we're all going to be practicing together, for me to practice equality, I'm giving everyone a new pair of running sneakers, and my students usually get really excited. They're like, "Are you really?" I'm not. But if I gave them a new pair of running sneakers, I gave them all size 8 women's because that's what I wear. So I found a really good deal. Everybody gets a size 8 women's sneaker to run this race. And my students look around and think, well, how is that going to happen? Right? For some of us, they might imagine I'm going to get blisters, right? The shoes will fall off. My foot won't even fit in this shoe. And that's absolutely true. So it is going to be extremely hard for individuals who don't have a size 8 women's shoe size to run this race successfully, because you're going to be in a lot of pain. You might even kick off your shoes and say, forget about this pair. And that is a really easy way that I help students think about why equity is so important, because it shows that even though everyone got the same thing, it wasn't useful for most people. It was only useful for people like me or somebody who might have that same shoe size. So we're going to transition briefly to application, and then I'm going to pause after this for any questions some individuals might have. So now that we've briefly discussed cultural relevancy, right? Why community is important and how cultural relevancy can increase our community connection. What do we do with all of this, right? How can we see it real time and apply it? So I want us to think about program inventory. Now this can be class inventory, syllabus inventory, program inventory, you name it, we can apply it. So when we think about, are we being culturally relevant in our practices, I often start with thinking about what are the materials, if you will, that are being offered to people. Who are the authors of these materials, right? Are they all from one specific region? Are they all from one specific university? And are they all from the United States, right? These are important things to think about, because even though we might not have tried to insinuate that all of the key or hallmark theorists are from one specific region of the United States or of the globe, because we only show that through our literature, we can actually give that message, right? That only the top authors come from this region or come from this school. The other thing to think about is theorists, right? Who are we saying are the people that we are basing our knowledge off of? Because theory oftentimes helps us think about creation of knowledge, right? How are we centering ourselves? How are we looking at this? So being mindful of who we're offering up as our theorists is really important. Also, if we're showing videos or photos, what do these people look like in the videos or photos? Do they all look like one type of individual? Do they all sound like one type of individual? And what about our photos? Ensuring that our photos are inclusive and really do show that we understand the importance of including lots of different types of experiences. And even though videos and photos might seem like a very superficial thing, they actually make a huge impact on how people feel like they are seen or heard. Guest speakers are also a really important thing to think about. If we are inviting people to come in, or an expert perhaps in some sort of technology or training to come in, it's okay to diversify that, right? Not just diversify that if we think about culture or race, think about that in terms of gender, think about that in terms of where individuals are from. And now that things are virtual, I have found it to be a little easier to actually invite scholars and guest speakers from across the country and globe, varying some time change, because now we can connect virtually. The second piece of this is thinking a little bit deeper if we're thinking about research or training materials. So one of the things that I really try to incorporate in the surveys that either I'm creating or assisting on different research teams or my students are creating is how we inquire about demographics. Now, I understand that some of our programs may have very specific demographic surveys that are sent out at the beginning of each workshop or each training, and those are pretty standard. The thing about demographics is the way that we ask the questions may also allow someone to feel excluded or maybe a little more included. So an example is when we have an open-ended demographic question, like for maybe ethnicity, and we say, here's, check one of these, and if you don't see your name, your ethnicity there, then click other. Now, the actual practice of clicking other does literally other somebody, right? It makes them feel outside of the group. It makes them feel not quote unquote normal in a sense. And I'm speaking from my personal experience and experiences with the community members and students I work with, because it makes you literally identify that you are something different that isn't named. So instead of putting other, the option I offer up is having a form that says, I'd like to include my own. And so that person can click that or check that and then write in their own identity. So instead of it being other, you're saying, I'd like to include my own identity, and that person can write their own. I know this is challenging if we are doing a big data grab or if we are sending it out to a large population, because we would have to check for that almost individually or look through it in a different way for the data. For me, it's important, right? That time spent is equally as important as it being easy to actually tabulate, because it helps me get to know the population better. The questions that we ask, the readings that we offer up, same thing goes for program inventory. I see you, one moment. And then also thinking about various modes that meet participants' needs. So if we are on virtual world, how are we providing different modes to help people feel comfortable with learning? An example that I try to incorporate within my trainings and teaching is, if you are unable to, unmute yourself, please feel free to use the chat box. If you don't have the capacity to turn your camera on, that's okay. Please feel free to use the little buttons that say raise your hand or clap or thumbs up. Oftentimes, even those small modes of allowing people to participate really helps, because we are uncertain at this time people's opportunities or options for including themselves in a technical or virtual space. And also, a lot of times for my students, they aren't home alone, right? They have family, they have siblings, and it also just decreases the level of vulnerability that some students have to assume versus others based on where they live, or if they're comfortable sharing the space where they live. There was one hand up. Go ahead.
When you said about the question about the race and ethnicity, and most often this is about sexuality or gender identity, we are always forcing people to either have a binary, like either it's male or female, and then you say that, okay, what's the other, so it's like, it should be like your name, like, nobody should be putting you into a category that you're with, what is it, what's your name, how would you like to be identified? That's as simple as that, I would think. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Yes, that is one that I know has been a big topic that some colleagues and I are working on in terms of 4-H and our youth extension programs, because we are acknowledging and seeing that there's a greater need, right? Youth are more mindful at this point, or they have the language that when I was growing up personally, I didn't have that language. And so how can we be inclusive of thinking about these demographics and not making a youth and or anyone categorize themselves as other specifically. Are there any questions or any comments before we shift? The last thing I'll point your attention to is the top right corner that says, saying nothing is still saying something. And I want us to really be mindful about that. This is something that is that happens quite frequently in trainings, or especially in my classes. If there's ever a time where something happens, someone says something that makes us feel like somebody could be feeling discriminated against, or somebody could be feeling left out, right? Even if we don't know what to say as educators, it is important to say something, because saying nothing can also still signal to somebody that we are okay with what happened, or potentially we don't know that something is wrong. So, and it also, for me, I think about my students is, I don't want any student to feel like they can't come talk to me about something that happened in the class. So we are very rarely are we prepared, especially to handle something that is happening real time. But in those spaces, it is okay to say, I'm not sure what just happened, but I feel, right? I feel uncomfortable. I feel like there may have been some harm done in the class, or I may feel like there is something that is making people feel uncomfortable. I can't name it right now, but I want to acknowledge that something happened, and we have to just acknowledge that something was said that may have impacted people in a certain way. And just naming it like that can be really helpful, because it does two things. One, it puts people on alert to be like, something did happen, or good, I felt it too. And then it allows me as the educator or leader to come back the next day and say, okay, right, I've had some time to think, and I want to be able to process with each other. And this is if you are uncomfortable. Some of us might be really comfortable right, approaching a situation real time, but from being mindful that saying nothing does still impact and does still communicate something to individuals. I'm gonna provide us this, and then I'm looking at the time because I want us to be able to have time to talk. Some challenges and opportunities that I want us to think about are just comfort versus safety. While there are some cases where if people are uncomfortable, it does insinuate that we also are unsafe. However, lots of times when we are talking about challenging conversations, sometimes people will push back because they say, oh, I feel unsafe. There's a difference though, when we feel uncomfortable because we are learning something new, or realizing that what we thought is not the correct thing. So just being mindful of that. There is power in vulnerability. We briefly touched upon it earlier, but thinking about how we can utilize ourselves as a tool to increase that trust within communities and with groups by simply acknowledging something that we are also, for example, that we are also still learning, right? I often share that what I call missteps, or situations when I realized that I could have handled something better, and how did I learn from that? There is no one size fits all solution, right? For anything, trust me, I've purchased some one size fits all clothes and they never fit. So I'm clearly not that one size fits all person. So when I think about that, just know that every situation will be different, right? We attend these trainings, we develop ourselves professionally by going to workshops and conferences and meeting different people. And that's wonderful. And we also have to know that something that works for one class or group may not work for another group, because as soon as that one person changes, a group dynamic changes. So just being mindful that this is a consistent thing that we are working on. We are constantly preparing and we are constantly tweaking things, because everyone brings something different all the time. Intent versus impact, which just means even though our intention might not be to leave somebody out or not to be exclusive, we can't control what we've done and if that impacts someone in a different way. Oftentimes I hear the phrases of, well, I didn't mean it like that, right? So-and-so says they feel disrespected, but I didn't mean to disrespect them. Absolutely, right? There's truth to both those things. An individual might not have said something to be disrespectful, but we can't control the impact that our words will have on other people. So being mindful and being okay to say, wow, I didn't know that what I said was going to do that. And being able to hold space for that dissonance and then unpack it between a group or a person. And this definitely takes some time to be comfortable with it. But it's really important when we think about including groups and individuals. The one I want to highlight is pretend versus real life. And I've called it this because in my spaces with students, I have come to understand that we are all living, right? It's what we're experiencing in society. When our students get into the classrooms, or when people get into learning spaces, oftentimes the things that are happening real time outside of the classrooms or the learning spaces are not being mentioned in class, because it's almost like once you get into the classroom, that all drops off, right? You're focusing on your academics and none of that really impacts or matters in the class. However, it still impacts our students and it still impacts our learners, even though they're inside the class trying to focus on something, right? My students who may be are thinking about where they're gonna get their next meal, they may be food insecure, that is impacting them in their learning spaces, right? People who are concerned for their family's safety, whether that be for a number of many different reasons, they will not stop thinking about that just because they're in a learning environment or they're supposed to be focusing on learning. So when we don't name that something is happening in the world, even for example, in the United States specifically, we're thinking about this like big election coming up, allowing space for people to even just name it can be helpful, because at least it acknowledges, for you as an educator, you're showing, I get it, right? There's lots of stuff going on. I'm not saying that you have to say, oh, this is how I'm voting or this is what I believe, but more so just opening the space to say, all right, everyone, right? You may acknowledge that your social media and the news has been filled with news about the election. I just want to offer space for that, right? Everybody take a deep breath. This is a lot of information coming at us all at once. And then you can move on to what we need to accomplish, right, in that educational time. But it's important to not pretend that nothing is going on outside of the classroom walls, because everything will impact an individual, even if they're supposed to be specifically learning something in your workshop or class. And the last thing I'll offer is, I don't know, which is a really powerful statement. And I want to offer up the opportunity to acknowledge that I don't know is really helpful, even if potentially it may put us in a vulnerable position. But saying something like saying, if a student asks you or a person asks you, well, how do you fix this? Right? If it's a social issue or if it's a technical issue for something you're training, saying I don't know shows vulnerability, but it also allows for a mutual learning experience to happen. Oftentimes students will ask me, well, I just saw this on the news. What do you think about this? And usually they're quicker about the news than I am because they are better at social media and they know how to sift through things really quickly. And I'll say, you know, I'm not sure. I need some time to think about it. I don't know how I feel about this yet, but thank you for bringing it to my attention, and I'll get back to you, because that also allows me some time to really think and not sort of just glance over what the key is or what the issue is for me. All right, so I'm gonna leave us with this and then open it up for questions if people have any time. But I wanted to offer up my contact info if anyone wanted to connect, but also just to remind us that inclusion is not simply about physical proximity. It is about intentionally planning for the success of our students. And so again, this can be for our students, for our community members, for our colleagues, whatever the audience is. Thinking about inclusion is not just physically diversifying or physically being close to what we think is diverse, but really planning for the success of people who are turning to us to help them learn a new concept or learn a new theory, or overall just feel included in a learning space. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for attending today, and I'll open it up for any questions if you have any.
I'd like to go back to where we started, if I
Sure.
could. I think this is excellent about community and building relationships and being vulnerable, but I'm finding in my old age as a white male that my desire to, and I really liked your comment about intent versus impact, but how do we use our positionality or our identity, as you described it, to engage in these controversial or social subjects without being unintentional, without revealing, I guess, our guilt or our privilege, or whatever words you want to put with that. Is I know I have a culture and an identity that's given me lots of privilege, but I still want to help those people without feeling like I'm parenting. So how do you engage without position?
Thank you. That's a great question. And one of the key ways is to just name and acknowledge that you understand that, right? Lots of times, unfortunately, people go into situations and don't understand that they do have that privileged perspective that allows them to say things that people in a non-dominant group could say, right? And for fear of maybe retaliation or safety or whatever the case may be. So I think just acknowledging that, to say like, look, I know what I have, right? I know my positionality, and you know, really just be honest about what your intention is. Now, I'm not saying that everybody will take it and be like, great, check, right? Go ahead, continue. But for those who are willing, right, to engage and to believe and trust you, then that's all it takes. I will say that the trust dynamic is also a really big component, right? We acknowledge that trust can't be created in an hour. Most, you know, I remember when I was younger, my grandmother telling me that there's two types of people who will trust you from the beginning, and people who won't trust you until you prove yourself, right, worthy of their trust. And that has been very true for me in my education experience, is that there will be some people who will be interested in what you have to say and jump right in. There's other people who it's going to take some time, and we can't control that, right? The individuals who are asking you, I'm going to need some time to trust you, or you're going to have to prove yourself, because there's been lots of things in personal lived experiences that make people, right, need to take care of themselves first before they let somebody in. The other thing I will say is there is a lot of self-education out there, and I know that you're probably aware of it, especially now over the last probably 6 months. There's been a lot of new trainings out there specifically for people who have who are in positions of power, whether that be professionally and or personally, and thinking about like, how do we unpack what we're going through, because it also is something, it takes a lot to acknowledge that, right? And then what do we do with acknowledging that and then moving forward? The thing I will say is everybody is different, right? And there's going to be some days where you will acknowledge power and privilege, and people will say, thank you so much for acknowledging that. Like, I really appreciate you being an advocate for me. There's other times where people will say, I've heard that about 10 times right today. And I'm uncertain of what to do with that. And that's okay, right? It's one thing to have expectations for ourselves. It's another thing to have expectations for someone to trust you from the beginning, right? It's just because you might have said something. So there isn't one specific answer. You know, I wish I had the answer. I'd probably be rich if I had the answer. But just thinking about knowing that it's a process and it's going to take baby steps. And some days those steps will help and some days they won't. But just keeping at it, because people will keep looking at you and realize, oh, you never went away in the first place, right? The first day I didn't believe you. I thought you would go away, but you're still here. So clearly, right, you are committed to the work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Suarez, I had a quick question. Hey, so you talked a little bit about theory and some of the traditional curriculum that we may be expected to use or teach. And I'm just curious, in your experience, how challenging has it been to kind of confront that or adjust that and try to make that more culturally relevant and look critically at that? Did you have any insights on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the example that I will use is a real-time example that I often have within my leadership development classes, in particular my global leadership or intercultural communication class. And theories, right, foundational theories are not bad. I don't want people to walk away thinking like, oh man, she was talking about how like these theories who helped us found a lot of our or foundational for our research were bad. That's not true. It's important to name though that, for example, in my global leadership class, we will look at some hallmark theories within global leadership and then unpack them, right? And I'll ask students to think about, right, who are the people who are the majority of those who are considered hallmark, right, theorists for these leadership practices. And then we'll start digging into, well, why is that, right? Do we think that only this population of individuals has that knowledge? No, right? So let's talk about why we think there's only one form of knowledge. And if we take these theorists or theories, and then also think about how we can incorporate other, right, scholars to adapt it to specific communities, that's been really helpful. The other thing I will say is when I've engaged with people who are specific, maybe technical science areas, they will say, well, I'm not sure, like, how do I know that other people have written theories, right? Other people who might be women of color, people from different countries. One of the big places that I offer up is, I know at least for the University of Florida, we have some wonderful liaison librarians who are specific to certain topics. And so whenever somebody asks me, hey, where do I find out, or how can I know new scholars? One, Google is totally awesome, right? Like I Google things probably about 20 times a day, and that's a starting point. But if you have access to a librarian, they are also really helpful because they can pull those specifics to at least get you started. And then the other thing too is once you find a few pieces, their reference list is also a really wonderful place to dive in deeper. But that's usually what I do because those hallmark theories are really helpful. Or like they help us establish and understand what these various theories are, right? Who made them, how they've been helping us shape our development over the years as a field, and that's the start, right? But just because those are the only ones that are listed in some really hallmark books doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't others out there that just happen to be born 20 or 50 years later, and that's the only reason they're not in this hallmark theory book. So being able to sort of mix things up a little bit like that has been really helpful.